At the dawn of the 20th century, universities like Harvard, Princeton, and Yale were prestigious, but they were not terribly selective. All you had to do was pass a series of subject-based entrance exams, and you were in. And the son of a New England Brahmin could continue to take the exams, even if he failed, could continue to take them until he passed. And even if he never passed, he could still backdoor his way into any of these universities with faculty approval. In 1907, for instance, 55% of Harvard's incoming freshman class did not pass their entrance exams. At Princeton, the number was 65%. It was the self-selecting nature of the applicant pool that ensured these universities consisted of what historians will use as the shorthand WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and all male as well. The high tuition was partly responsible, as was the fact that the subject tests were in Latin and Greek. Two of them were, which were subjects that were offered by the elite private schools in New England, but not offered by your traditional public school. But over the course of the early decades of the 20th century, the enterprising sons of Eastern European Jewish immigrants began to take advantage of these lax admissions standards and increase their presence on campus very rapidly. And this trend was a source of grave alarm for administrators. It was feared that more Jews would lead wealthy WASP applicants to seek their education at other institutions and would weaken the traditional bonds of power between these elite schools and the corridors of business and power. By 1918, Harvard had become 20% Jewish. Columbia was even more Jewish, 40%. As one college song from the era had the following lyrics: "Oh, Harvard's run by millionaires, and Yale is run by booze. Cornell is run by farmers' sons. Columbia's run by Jews." Columbia had successfully moved to limit its Jewish enrollment in an effort to deter WASP flight, bringing the proportion of Jews down to 22%. Harvard University President A. Lawrence Lowell took note and advocated similar measures in Cambridge. He realized that by considering character alongside academics and admissions, Harvard could screen out Jews. Much to the press's credit, Lowell's plan met with criticism in the pages of various publications. Still, Lowell pressed ahead, and Harvard developed a method to determine if a given applicant was likely Jewish. They would look at your last name, where you went to high school, what your parents did. So for instance, if you, if your last name was a traditionally Jewish last name and you went to Bronx Science in New York and your father was a tailor, they thought you were likely Jewish. And so they would put J1, J2, or J3 on your application, depending on how likely they thought it was that you were a Jewish applicant. Now, to be clear, this is not a monolithic case where every white Anglo-Saxon Protestant was trying to discriminate against every Jewish applicant. Many WASPs spoke out stridently against these practices. And it may surprise you to learn that many of the more established Jewish families of Western European origin actually assisted their alma maters in suppressing the undesirable Jewish newcomers from Eastern Europe, most conspicuously at Dartmouth and Williams. As Walter Lippmann, a Harvard-trained German Jew who was a prominent writer, said, "My sympathies are with the non-Jew. His personal manners and physical habits are, I believe, distinctly superior to the prevailing manners and habits of the Jews." Non-Jews sometimes articulated a similar acceptance of assimilated Jews while shunning immigrants. One Harvard alumnus wrote to Lowell, "My business life has been spent in New York, where one stumbles over Jews at every turn. And I am not anxious for my boys to come into contact with them until they absolutely have to. They are without a doubt the damned of God and the skunks of the human race. I grant you that there are many Jews, like the Strauss family, who cannot even be remotely criticized. But generally speaking, they're a menace to decent society and the American race." A little further south in New Haven, Yale administrators took note that Harvard's efforts to suppress Jewish enrollment garnered negative publicity. And so Yale tried to solve its Jewish problem more discreetly. In 1921, Yale found itself with its highest proportion of Jewish students ever, 13%. While an internal study found that Jews were actually outperforming their Christian peers academically, they were socially marginalized on campus. Yale began to deliberately deny scholarships to Jewish students as a means to suppress enrollment. Still, the proportion of Jews actually increased the following year to 13.3%. Yale, in turn, began to consider personality and character alongside academics, and this gave them the flexibility they needed to cut Jewish enrollment from 115 students to 88. Proportionally, it would be 40 years before Jews made up this lost ground at Yale University. The drive to maintain Yale's Anglo-Saxon character led it to admit incoming classes where fully 1/3 came from only 8 high schools, all elite private high schools in the Northeast. Yale also began to adopt officially 2 different standards in admissions with respect to legacies. Legacies officially needed a lower score to be granted admission. Even with the suppression of Jewish enrollment, many Yalees agitated against the residual Jewish presence on campus. The dean of admissions penned a letter to the board about a published list of boys from Connecticut who were Yale-bound. He wrote, "The list as published reads like some of the begat portions of the Old Testament and might easily be mistaken for a roll call at the Wailing Wall." It was in this context that Yale's Jewish population dwindled to 8% by 1930. The key to this success was regional discrimination. In Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia combined, which collectively were home to half America's Jewish population, in those 3 cities combined, only 13 public school students went to Yale that year. That number is half the number sent by a single boarding school in New Hampshire. Although Princeton had far fewer Jews than Harvard or Yale relative to its numbers at the turn of the 20th century, Princeton saw an all-time high of 25 Jews in 1922. The few Jews at Princeton lived on the margins. The prestigious eating clubs had only 1 Jew. Princeton managed to cut its Jewish enrollment in half by 1924. And this at a time when Princeton's acceptance rate was steadily climbing to 80%. That's 80%. If we zoom out and we look at the broader cultural context of the 1920s, these restrictive admissions practices are hardly a surprise. This was the era of the first Red Scare, of legislation in Congress to curb immigration, of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, of the eugenics movement. This push to restrict Jewish enrollment in these universities was part and parcel of a broadly reactionary moment in American history. Under Lowell's successor, Harvard relaxed its 15% quota on Jewish students that Lowell had implemented, but the admissions policy still discriminated against Jews. Princeton, Williams, and Dartmouth all had less than 5% Jewish populations and threatened to siphon off the future WASP CEOs and senators from Harvard. Harvard's strategy of regional diversity continued to keep Jewish enrollment down. The overall acceptance rate at Harvard by 1949 was 56%, but in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, heavily Jewish states, it was only 35%. But this kind of discriminatory practice could not last much longer. American Jews had done their share in World War II, and they demanded more of the United States when they returned home. In the wake of the Holocaust, there was a growing sense of urgency that the U.S. had to purge itself of its residual anti-Semitism. Jewish Harvard alumni began to mobilize and protest Harvard's admissions policies. Moreover, Massachusetts passed the Fair Educational Practices Law, which prohibited religious discrimination in college admissions. By 1952, Harvard's Jewish population had grown to 25%, a number that it maintains to this day. Meanwhile, Yale's head of admissions wrote as late as 1945, "The proportion of Jews among candidates who are both scholastically qualified and young enough to matriculate remains too large for comfort." That same year, a Yale law professor wrote to Yale's president to say that the ground was shifting beneath their feet. Harvard could not stave off the forces of change, and neither could Yale. That law professor observed, our experience with Hitlerism in all its forms has changed the meaning of anti-Semitism and other kinds of group discrimination. They are no longer merely unattractive social sins, but a powerful symbol, a political weapon, a tool of violence. Meanwhile, New York City threatened to strip Columbia of its tax-exempt status if it continued to discriminate against Jewish and Black students. Many top universities also began to realize by mid-century that if they were most inclined to admit the sons of affluent and athletic New England Brahmin, that they would risk falling behind their peers who had made more of an effort to recruit solely intellectually stellar applicants. And if anyone's interested in reading more about this, I highly recommend Jerome Carabel's The Chosen, which I draw from today. Now that I've outlined the history of discrimination against Jews and its reversal, I want to connect that history to current research on inequality in the modern American academy. For several decades now, women, as well as religious and racial minorities, have enjoyed access to lecture halls and laboratories once reserved for the scions of the WASP patrician class. Yet this newfound diversity has been incomplete. This meritocratic elite has proven just as adept as their WASP predecessors at using exclusive universities to reinforce their privileged position. Students with high socioeconomic status, high SES, are not only overrepresented at prestigious institutions, but their proportion is growing. In 1971, 25% of college students came from families where neither parent had a college degree on these elite campuses. Only slightly higher percentage, 28%, came from families where both parents had attended college. A 2004 study showed that at those same kinds of institutions, the percentage of students who were among the first generation to go to college had plummeted to 9%. Those students where both parents had college degrees had skyrocketed to 62%. Even when controlling for grades and SATs, socioeconomic status still plays a major role in college admissions. High SES families have established their dominance through a wide array of means. They enroll their children in private schools or are more likely to move to areas that have high-quality public schools. When high SES students apply to college, their families often fund SAT classes, tours of prospective universities, and applications to those institutions. Colleges at the pinnacle of the academic hierarchy give weight to extracurricular activities when considering applicants. Accordingly, high SES families encourage their children to participate in such activities. Once admitted, children from high SES families are more likely to have their parents shoulder the financial burden of tuition and living expenses, providing a crucial advantage at a time when students have seen a meteoric rise in the cost of tuition. By the year 2023, the average four-year public university is going to cost, on average, over $40,000 a year. By 2023, the average private university, over $82,000 annually. In light of these numbers, it comes as little surprise that students on these elite campuses come from households with an average yearly income of over $120,000 a year, more than twice the national average. For those students who assume huge sums of debt to attend college, they are much less likely than their affluent, debt-free peers to readily enroll in graduate education. In sum, privileged families invest in and draw from a constellation of educational, social, financial capital to accrue the requisite merit to pass through the gates of an elite university. What does any of this have to do with America's founding? I would argue a lot. Equality of opportunity is a quintessentially American ethic that traces its origins to the revolution that brought the United States into being. As Gordon Wood writes in his classic text, The Radicalism of the American Revolution, equality was, in fact, the most radical and powerful ideological force let loose in the revolution. Its appeal was far more potent than any of the revolutionaries realized. Once invoked, the idea of equality could not be stopped, and it tore through American society and culture with awesome power. From our nation's beginning, the promise of the Declaration of Independence worked in tension with the realities of an America based on white, male, landed privilege. But the story of the United States, in many ways, has been the story of marginalized peoples making Thomas Jefferson's immortal words real for all Americans. So it was with the Jewish students and black students and female students who demanded equality in university admissions. Will it also be the case for those students of modest background hoping to have a chance at a better education and a better life? I can't help but look at the history of this country and be hopeful. Thank you.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.